The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that sits too heavy in your chest and makes the hallway feel longer than it really is. I was standing under fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead, staring at a closed hospital room door while a doctor spoke in careful sentences behind me. He kept saying things like non-life-threatening and stable condition. He said them gently, like he was trying not to bruise me with the truth. But none of those words mattered. Because what he didn't say, what no one would say, was that my son would never walk the same way again. Benjamin is 16. He's the kind of boy who apologizes when other people bump into him. He's never been in trouble. Never raised his voice. Never fought back. When they told me it took 7 students to put him in that hospital bed, my first thought wasn't anger. It was disbelief. 7 against 1 isn't an accident. 7 against 1 isn't a joke. And it certainly isn't a prank, no matter how many times that word gets repeated in a conference room. I remember gripping the edge of a plastic chair so hard my fingers went numb while a nurse adjusted the blanket over Benjamin's legs. He didn't open his eyes. He didn't move. And when I asked if he could feel his feet, the room went very, very quiet. That's when I understood something important. Whatever happened at that school didn't end on the hallway floor where my son collapsed. It followed him here. It followed us into this building. And it was already being managed, minimized, and buried before I'd even been told the full story. Within the first hour, the language shifted. It wasn't what happened to your son. It became, we're still gathering details. Then let's not rush to conclusions. And finally, these are good kids with bright futures. That was the moment I realized the sides had already been chosen. Because while my son lay motionless behind that door, 7 other boys were being protected by titles, connections, and laughter behind closed meetings I wasn't invited into. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I didn't cry in front of them. I just listened. And I let them believe what they wanted to believe, that I was overwhelmed, emotional, and grateful they were handling it internally. They thought I was another mother who would eventually get tired, get scared, and let it go. They were wrong. Before we go any further, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It truly means a lot to me seeing this community of parents, survivors, and truth seekers grow across cities, countries, and time zones. Every comment, like, and share helps us keep these stories visible and protect voices that powerful systems would rather silence, together. Before that day, my life was small in the best possible way. It moved in routines and quiet habits. Morning light through the kitchen window. The low hum of the kettle while I packed Benjamin's lunch. The same argument every weekday about whether 16-year-olds really needed jackets when the weather was not that cold. He always forgot his charger. I always reminded him. We laughed about it like it was a rule of the universe that neither of us could change. Benjamin had a way of moving through the world that made me both proud and afraid. He didn't take up space. He didn't demand attention. He listened more than he spoke. When other boys his age were loud and reckless, my son noticed details. How the neighbor's dog limped when it walked. How I sighed when bills came in the mail. How silence sometimes meant more than words. He was gentle in a world that rewards force, and I worried about that more than I ever admitted out loud. That morning felt ordinary enough to be forgettable. I remember standing at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug, watching him tie his shoes by the door. He was wearing the same hoodie he always wore, the one with frayed cuffs I kept meaning to replace. He slung his backpack over one shoulder and smiled at me, quick and easy, like he always did. "Love you, Mom," he said. "I love you more," I replied, already reaching for my phone to check the time, to remind him he'd miss the bus if he didn't hurry. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Not a slam. Benjamin never slammed doors. If I had known that was the last normal moment we'd share for a long time, I would have memorized it. I would have held on to it tighter. But life doesn't warn you before it breaks itself in half. The hours after he left blurred together the way they always did. I answered emails, folded laundry, made a mental list of groceries we didn't really need but would probably buy anyway. I thought about dinner, whether he'd be tired, whether he'd complain if I made something healthy instead of comforting. These were the thoughts of a woman who believed her biggest problems were small. The phone rang sometime afternoon. At first, I ignored it. I was in the middle of something, standing by the counter, I think, or maybe sitting on the couch. The sound felt intrusive, sharp against the quiet of the house. When it rang again, something in my chest tightened, sudden and uninvited. I don't know why I answered the second ring instead of the third. I just know my hand moved before my mind caught up. Hello. The voice on the other end didn't say my name right away. There was a pause. Too long. Then someone cleared their throat. Is this Dorothy? A woman asked. Yes, I said. This is she. I'm calling from the school, she continued, her tone practiced, controlled, already bracing for impact. There's been an incident involving your son, Benjamin. The word incident landed wrong. It was too soft, too clean. My heart began to pound, each beat louder than the last. What kind of incident? I asked. Another pause. I could hear voices in the background now. Movement. Urgency. Your son has been taken to the hospital, she said. An ambulance was called. He's stable, but we need you to go there immediately. The room tilted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough that I had to sit down before my legs gave out. What happened? I asked, already knowing I wasn't about to get a straight answer. There was a situation, she said. Some students were involved. The administration is aware and… I didn't let her finish. I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I remember the front door slamming this time, hard enough to rattle the frame, and thinking, distantly, that Benjamin would have apologized for that sound. The drive to the hospital felt unreal. Red lights became suggestions. Speed limits stopped meaning anything. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my hands hurt, like pain could keep me anchored to reality. Every horrible possibility crowded my mind at once. Broken bones. Blood. Things I refused to name, because naming them might make them real. By the time I reached the hospital, my heart was racing so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. The automatic door slid open, and the smell hit me first, antiseptic and something metallic underneath it. Fear has a smell. You don't forget it once you've learned it. I rushed to the front desk, words tumbling out of me too fast. My son, Benjamin. He was brought in from a high school, I said. They said he was stable. Where is he? The nurse looked at the screen, then at me. Her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Room 317, she said softly. You can go straight back. The walk down that hallway felt endless. Each step echoed too loudly. My breath sounded wrong in my ears, shallow and uneven. When I reached the door, my hand hovered over the handle for just a moment longer than it should have. I wasn't ready, but I went in anyway. The first thing I noticed was how still he was. Benjamin lay on the bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed like they were trying to replace something his body could no longer do on its own. His face was pale, his eyes closed, lashes resting against bruised skin. There were marks I didn't recognize, swelling that didn't belong on my child. His legs were covered with a blanket, tucked in carefully, almost respectfully. That detail broke me more than anything else. I stepped closer, my movements slow, like I was afraid sudden motion might shatter him. I took his hand. It was warm, thank God, but limp in mine. He didn't squeeze back. "Benjamin," I whispered. "Mom's here." A doctor entered behind me, clipboard in hand, posture professional, distant. He explained things calmly, like he was delivering information that didn't have the power to destroy someone's entire world. "He sustained a spinal injury," he said. "We're still running tests, but there's damage. It's too early to say how much function he'll regain." The words blurred together after that. Spinal, damage, recovery, therapy. The language of uncertainty wrapped itself around my throat. "Was he alone?" I asked, my voice barely steady enough to recognize as my own. "What happened?" The doctor hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. But I saw it. "There were multiple students involved," he said carefully. "How many?" I asked. Another pause. "7, he said. 7. The number lodged itself in my chest, heavy and sharp. 7 boys. 7 bodies against one. My son's body. I thought of his quiet voice, his slouched shoulders, the way he avoided conflict even when it cost him something. I thought of 7 sets of hands, 7 choices made in a moment that would now define the rest of his life. "Was it a fight?" I asked. The doctor didn't answer directly. He never did. "It's being described as hazing," he said. "A prank that went too far." A prank. I looked back at my son, at the tubes and wires and the unnatural stillness of his legs beneath the blanket, and something inside me went cold. Not numb, not empty, just very, very clear. This wasn't an accident. And whatever happened next wasn't going to be simple. As the doctor left and the machines continued their steady rhythm, I sat beside my son and held his hand, staring at the wall across from me. I felt grief, yes. Fear. A deep, aching sorrow that pressed down on my lungs. But beneath all of that, something else was taking shape. A realization. Whatever story they were already telling about what happened to Benjamin, it wasn't the truth. And if I didn't protect it, if I didn't hold on to it with everything I had, it would disappear just as quietly as my son's footsteps had that morning when he walked out the door, never knowing how violently the world was about to change him. They didn't tell me everything at once. That's how I know they knew it was wrong. At first, the number came wrapped in soft language. Several students. A group of boys. Words meant to blur edges, to keep the picture fuzzy enough that I wouldn't ask the next question. But once the doctor said it, once that single word lodged itself inside me, it wouldn't let go. 7. I said it out loud later, alone in the hospital bathroom, staring at my own reflection like I was checking to see if I still existed. 7 boys. 7 decisions. 7 moments where someone could have stopped and didn't. I replayed it again and again, trying to understand the physics of it. How does one body withstand 7? How long does it take before fear turns into surrender? Before your muscles give up because your mind already has? When Benjamin woke briefly that evening, his eyes fluttered open just enough to find me. His voice was weak, barely a sound, but it carried more weight than anything else in that room. "Mom," he whispered. "I'm here," I said quickly, leaning in, afraid to miss even a breath of him. He swallowed hard. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling, then back to my face. There was shame there. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because the world had taught him that surviving something like this somehow made him responsible for it. "I didn't fight back," he said. That sentence cracked something open in me. "I know," I told him, my voice steady even as my chest burned. "You didn't have to." He closed his eyes again, exhausted by the effort of speaking. But his words stayed with me long after the machines settled back into their rhythm. I didn't fight back. As if fighting back would have justified what they did. As if the problem wasn't 7 boys cornering one. By the next morning, the story had already started changing shape. A woman from the school district called while I was still sitting by Benjamin's bed, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her voice was polite, professional, and carefully empty. "We're aware of the situation involving your son," she said. "We want you to know the school is taking it very seriously." I asked her how many students were involved. There was a pause long enough to confirm everything I needed to know. 7, she said finally. "But we need to be careful about how we characterize what happened." Careful. That word kept coming up. Careful with language. Careful with accusations. Careful with reputations. No one asked me to be careful with my son. They scheduled a meeting for 2 days later, once Benjamin was moved out of intensive monitoring and into a recovery room. I didn't want to leave him, but he squeezed my hand weakly and told me to go. He was already learning how much space his pain would take up in my life, and he hated it. The school building looked the same as it always had. Brick walls, clean hallways, trophy cases gleaming under fluorescent lights. It felt obscene, walking past glass cabinets filled with awards while my son lay in a hospital bed learning what his body could no longer do. They seated me at a long table in a windowless room. Across from me sat people with titles instead of faces: the principal, an assistant superintendent, a school board representative. Not one of them looked surprised to see me. They started with sympathy. "We're so sorry about what happened to Benjamin," the principal said, hands folded neatly in front of him. "This has been very difficult for everyone." Everyone. They spoke next about values, about community, about how incidents like this didn't reflect the culture of the school. Then they shifted. "This was an unfortunate hazing prank that escalated," the board representative said. "There was no intent to cause serious harm." I waited. Let them keep talking. Silence makes people uncomfortable. Eventually, they fill it. "The boys involved are cooperative," she continued. "They come from good families. This isn't who they are." I leaned forward then, placing my hands flat on the table, feeling the cool surface ground me. "My son can't feel his legs," I said calmly. "Who are they?" The room stilled. "We're handling this internally," the assistant superintendent said, "for the privacy of all students involved." "My son is a student," I replied. "His privacy doesn't seem to be a concern." They exchanged looks. Quick. Efficient. Practiced. "We don't want to ruin 7 young lives over a mistake," the principal said gently. "College applications. Scholarships. Futures are at stake." There it was. 7 futures weighed carefully against one broken body. I felt something inside me settle, not explode, not shatter. Settle. Like a decision finally making itself. "So is my son's," I said. Or was. They didn't like that. I could tell. My refusal to cry, to beg, to perform the grief they expected unsettled them. "We recommend focusing on Benjamin's recovery," the board representative said. "Let the school handle the disciplinary process." I picture my son that morning, lying still beneath white sheets, learning that his world had shrunk without his consent. "No," I said. The word surprised them. "No," I repeated. "You don't get to decide that for me." The principal sighed, the sound thin with irritation. "Mrs. Harris," he said, "sometimes pushing too hard only makes things worse." I looked at him, then really looked at the framed photos on the wall behind him, at the awards, at the carefully curated image of leadership and success. "What you're really saying," I said quietly, "is that you'd prefer I stay quiet." No one corrected me. The meeting ended shortly after that. Polite smiles. Empty assurances. Promises to stay in touch. As I walked out of the building, past the lockers and the banners and the posters about integrity, I felt the full weight of what I was up against. This wasn't just about 7 boys. It was about a system that had already decided whose pain mattered and whose didn't. And as I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel the same way I had on the drive to the hospital, one truth became impossible to ignore. If I left this in their hands, my son's story would be reduced to a footnote. And I wasn't willing to let that happen. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as courtesy. After the meeting, no one raised their voice at me. No one threatened me outright. That would have been too obvious, too crude. Instead, doors closed softly. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls were returned with carefully neutral tones that said everything without committing to anything at all. I left messages that began polite and hopeful. I followed up with messages that were shorter, more precise. Eventually, I stopped leaving messages altogether and waited to see who would call me back. Almost no one did. When they did, the conversations followed the same shape. Sympathy first, concern second, and then the gentle redirection. We understand how emotional this must be for you. We're just trying to protect all students involved. This process takes time. Time, I learned, was a luxury reserved for people whose lives hadn't already been rearranged. At the hospital, days blurred into each other. Morning light through the narrow window. Nurses rotating in quiet shifts. Doctors speaking in probabilities instead of promises. Benjamin endured it all with a patience that broke my heart. He asked questions without accusation. He listened without anger. He apologized too often. "I'm sorry you have to be here so much," he said one afternoon, his voice thin with exhaustion. "You don't ever have to apologize to me," I replied, brushing his hair back gently. "Not for this. Not for anything." But I knew where the apology came from. He could feel the weight of what his injury was costing me: time, sleep, energy, stability. The world had already started teaching him that being hurt was an inconvenience to others. The school's presence remained conspicuously absent. No administrator came to see him. No counselor stopped by. No one asked him how he was coping. The people who had once been so quick to talk about community and values now communicated only through statements and intermediaries. When I pushed harder, the tone shifted. A voicemail came in late one afternoon while I was standing at the vending machine, debating whether stale crackers counted as food. "Dorothy," the voice said, overly familiar, "I just wanted to gently remind you that escalating this situation publicly may not be in Benjamin's best interest." I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the hum of the machine and the blood rushing through my head. Publicly. The word felt deliberate. A warning disguised as advice. Another message followed 2 days later, this time from someone I didn't recognize. The number was local. The voice was male, calm, authoritative. "I'm calling on behalf of the board," he said. "We're concerned about the direction this is heading. These families have resources, legal ones. It would be unfortunate if things became adversarial." Adversarial. I deleted the message without responding, my hands shaking just enough to make it difficult. It became clear then that the silence wasn't emptiness. It was strategy. They weren't ignoring me because they didn't hear me. They were waiting me out, counting on fatigue, counting on fear, counting on the reality that most people eventually have to choose between fighting and surviving. They assumed I would choose survival. At night, when the hospital grew quiet and Benjamin slept, I sat alone in the hard plastic chair by his bed and listened to the steady beep of the monitor. I watched his chest rise and fall. I memorized the small scar on his collarbone I hadn't noticed before. I wonder how many moments like this I'd missed while he was growing up, busy believing there would always be more time. That's when the doubt started to creep in. What if they were right? What if pushing meant dragging Benjamin through years of legal battles and public scrutiny? What if it meant reliving the worst day of his life over and over again? What if my insistence on justice cost him the quiet, fragile peace he needed to heal? The questions circled endlessly, feeding on my exhaustion. I imagined him older, resentful. Imagined him telling me one day that I should have let it go, that I should have protected him from the fight instead of pulling him into it. The thought hollowed me out. And then there were the looks. The careful, sidelong looks from nurses who didn't know what to say anymore. The strained smiles from acquaintances who stopped asking for updates after the first week. Even well-meaning friends began to suggest softly that maybe it was time to focus on moving forward. Moving forward. As if you could walk away from something when your child couldn't walk at all. The breaking point didn't come with a scream. It came with a file. I was at home for the first time in days, showering and changing clothes while Benjamin slept under the watchful care of a night nurse. The house felt wrong without him. Too quiet. Too empty. His shoes still sat by the door where he'd kicked them off that morning. I hadn't moved them. An envelope lay on the kitchen counter, unmarked, slipped through the mail slot sometime that afternoon. No return address. Just my name, written neatly, almost politely. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a summary. Clinical. Detached. The school's internal report. Hazing incident involving multiple students. No malicious intent determined. No prior history of severe misconduct. Disciplinary measures consistent with district policy. At the bottom, a line caught my eye. Injury outcomes inconclusive at time of reporting. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Inconclusive. As if my son's paralysis were a temporary inconvenience. As if his future were a variable to be adjusted later. I felt something rise up from a place deeper than anger, deeper than grief. It was a cold clarity that cut through the noise in my head. They weren't just minimizing what happened. They were rewriting it. My hands shook as I read the report again, slower this time. I noticed what was missing. No mention of witnesses. No mention of the duration. No acknowledgement of the power imbalance. No acknowledgement of 7 bodies against 1. It wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. I sank into a chair, the paper crumpling slightly in my grip, and for the first time since the hospital, I cried. Not quietly, not politely. I cried with the full weight of everything I had been holding back pressing down on my chest. I cried for the boy who left the house that morning expecting nothing more than another ordinary day. I cried for the mother who believed institutions existed to protect children. I cried for the version of myself who still thought that staying calm and reasonable would be enough. When the tears finally stopped, something else took their place. Resolve. I wiped my face, smoothed the paper flat on the table, and read it one last time. Not as a grieving mother, but as someone assessing a problem. They had made a mistake. They thought silence would weaken me. They thought subtle threats would scare me into retreat. They thought my restraint was compliance. They were wrong. That night, I opened my laptop and began to document everything. Dates, names, times, exact wording. I wrote down every call, every message, every pause that spoke louder than words. I didn't rush. I didn't rage. I worked carefully, methodically, the way you do when you finally understand that this isn't just about emotion, it's about truth. For weeks, I had been reacting. That night, I made a decision. I would stop asking them to do the right thing. I would make it impossible for them to do anything else. And as I shut the laptop and turned off the lights, the house no longer felt empty. It felt like a place where something was beginning. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't tell friends or family that something had shifted inside me. From the outside, nothing changed. I was still the exhausted mother moving between hospital rooms and my quiet house. Still polite. still measured, still thanking people for their time. That was the point. When people think you are worn down, they stop guarding themselves. They speak more freely. They cut corners. They assume you don't have the energy to notice details anymore. They were wrong. I started with what I already had. Every email, every voicemail, every missed call that had never been returned. I went back weeks, reading messages slowly, listening again to the pauses in people's voices, the careful phrasing, the words they chose when they thought they were being helpful. I wrote everything down in a plain notebook. Dates, times, names, exact quotes. No emotions, no commentary, just facts. At the hospital, I paid attention. I noticed which nurses lowered their voices when they spoke about the school, which ones hesitated before answering simple questions. One afternoon, while adjusting Benjamin's blanket, a nurse said quietly, "I've seen this before," and then stopped herself. I didn't push. I just nodded and let the silence do the work. Later that evening, she came back. "I shouldn't say this," she murmured, eyes on the 4 line instead of my face, but there were witnesses. Other kids. Not all of them were involved. That was all she said. It was enough. I began asking questions that sounded harmless. Who was on hallway duty that day? Who supervised after-school activities? What time did the ambulance arrive? Each answer opened another door. Schedules. Logs. Camera placements. Gaps. I learned which cameras worked and which ones didn't. Which hallways were always under maintenance. Which records were kept digitally and which were still handwritten. I learned how often errors happened and to whom. At night, after Benjamin fell asleep, I sat beside his bed with my phone dimmed and typed notes into a document I never titled. I kept backups in places no one else would think to look. I didn't rush. Rushing makes mistakes. Benjamin watched me sometimes. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't need to. There was a look in his eyes now, something quieter, heavier. He was learning the shape of his new body, the limits of it. Physical therapy was exhausting. Some days he pushed himself harder than he should have. Other days he barely spoke. One night, as I packed my things to leave, he said, "Mom?" "Yes." "Are they going to get away with it?" The question wasn't angry. It wasn't hopeful either. It was practical, like someone asking about the weather. I sat back down and took his hand. "No," I said. "They're not." He studied my face, searching for doubt. He didn't find it. The proof didn't come all at once. It never does. It came in fragments. A forwarded message from a parent who suddenly felt uneasy. A screenshot from a student who didn't want their name attached to it. A hallway video that showed movement where none was supposed to be. A discrepancy in the school's own timeline that didn't match emergency response logs. Each piece on its own was small. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are harder to dismiss. I didn't leak anything. I didn't confront anyone yet. I waited until the story they'd told no longer matched the evidence they'd forgotten to erase. When I finally requested another meeting, the response was swift. Of course it was. They had assumed I would fade. When I didn't, curiosity turned into concern. The room was different this time. Larger, brighter, a longer table, more people, faces I hadn't seen before. Legal counsel, district representatives. The school board chair sat at the head, posture confident, hands folded neatly as if she were presiding over something ceremonial instead of catastrophic. They began the same way they always did. "We appreciate you coming in. We know this has been an emotional time. We want to resolve this constructively." I let them speak. I watched who avoided my eyes, who leaned back too comfortably, who took notes and who didn't. When they finished, there was a pause. Expectant. They thought I was there to negotiate. I slid a folder across the table. Not thick. Not dramatic.
Clean.
Organized. Inside were timelines. Copies of messages. Logs that contradicted official statements. Screenshots that showed coordination where there was supposed to be coincidence. A clear record of who knew what and when. No commentary. Just truth. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't polite. It was heavy. One of the attorneys flipped through the pages slowly, his expression tightening just enough to notice. The board chair stopped tapping her pen. "I don't understand," she said carefully. "Where did you get this information?" I met her gaze evenly. "From your systems," I said. "And from the people who assumed I wouldn't look." Someone cleared their throat. "This material is concerning," the attorney said. "But you need to understand that there are protocols." "I understand protocols," I interrupted gently. "I also understand records retention laws, mandatory reporting requirements, and the difference between an internal review and obstruction." That got their attention. I wasn't raising my voice. I didn't need to. The room had shifted. They could feel it. I continued, calmly, laying out the inconsistencies. The missing footage. The altered language. The decision to classify the incident in a way that avoided external review. The communication between administrators and parents that suggested coordination rather than concern. No accusations. Just facts. When I finished, I closed the folder. "I didn't come here to argue," I said. "And I didn't come here to beg." "What do you want?" the board chair asked, her confidence thinning around the edges. I thought of Benjamin, of his quiet apology, of the way he flinched when a door closed too loudly now, of the mornings that would never look the same. "I want accountability," I said. "Not statements. Not policies. Accountability." The attorney leaned forward. "And if we can't give you what you're asking for?" I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "Then this won't stay here." No threats. No theatrics. Just inevitability. They asked for time. They always do. I agreed. Time, after all, works both ways. When I left the building, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Bone-deep tired. But there was something else there too, a steadiness I hadn't felt since before the call that shattered my life. The confrontation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the moment they realized I wasn't asking anymore. And as I walked to my car, phone vibrating with messages I didn't read yet, I knew something they didn't want to admit to themselves. The story was no longer under their control. And it never would be again. The fallout didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came the way consequences usually do, quietly at first, then all at once. For a few days after the meeting, nothing happened. No calls. No emails. No updates. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Tighter. Watchful. Like a room where everyone is holding their breath, waiting to see who speaks first. I let them sit in that discomfort. Benjamin noticed the shift before I said anything. He always did. He watched me the way I watched him, carefully, reading what I didn't say. "They're scared," he said one afternoon during physical therapy, his jaw clenched as he worked through an exercise that left him shaking. "Why do you think that?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "Because people who aren't scared don't go quiet like that." He was right. The first crack appeared at the school. A short message went out to parents about an ongoing internal review.
Vague.
Carefully worded. The kind of message meant to reassure without admitting anything at all. But people had started talking. Parents compare notes. They always have. Then a teacher took leave. No explanation. Just a sudden absence. A week later, the principal resigned. The announcement framed it as a personal decision. I read it twice, then closed my phone and sat very still. I didn't feel relief. I felt something closer to gravity, an acknowledgement that what I had set in motion could not be undone. More changes followed. Quiet ones. A board member stepping down. A policy update circulated internally. Counseling services suddenly made available to students who had experienced trauma. It would have been easy to see it all as victory. But victory wasn't what this felt like. Benjamin's body didn't change because someone lost their job. His legs didn't wake up because an email was sent. The cost of what happened to him wasn't something that could be balanced by consequences alone. The boys involved were no longer spoken of by name. They became students under review. Then, former students. Their futures, once discussed so openly in that conference room, faded into quiet uncertainty. I didn't celebrate that either. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition. I wanted the truth to exist where it couldn't be erased or softened. One evening, as I sat by Benjamin's bed, he asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you think they hate us?" he asked. "Who?" I said gently. "Them," he replied. "The school. The parents. Everyone." I thought about it for a moment. "I don't think they hate us," I said. "I think they're afraid of what happens when silence stops working." He nodded slowly, considering that. "I don't want to be angry forever," he said. "You won't be," I told him. "Anger's not where this ends." The official acknowledgement came months later. Not public. Not dramatic. A formal letter. Careful language. Responsibility admitted without naming names. A settlement that included funding for Benjamin's long-term care, therapy, and education. When I signed the papers, my hand didn't shake. That surprised me. I had imagined that moment would feel like closure, like relief. But what it really felt like was permission to stop holding my breath, to stop living in reaction to what had been done to us. The story didn't belong to them anymore. And it didn't have to belong to the fight either. Benjamin came home in the early spring. The house had changed in small ways. Ramps where there hadn't been before. Rearranged furniture. Space cleared deliberately, thoughtfully. It wasn't a reminder of loss. It was an acknowledgement of reality. He wheeled himself through the doorway and paused, taking it all in. His room looked the same. Posters still on the walls, books stacked unevenly on his desk, but it felt different now, like a place he would have to learn again. "Smells like home," he said softly. I smiled, blinking back tears I hadn't realized were there. The first weeks were hard. Harder than either of us admitted. There were setbacks. Frustrations. Nights when he stared at the ceiling, silent, and mornings when he snapped over things that didn't matter. I learned when to push and when to let him be. He learned that needing help didn't mean losing himself. Slowly, things shifted. He found new rhythms, new strengths. Physical therapy sessions turned into small victories. A transfer made without help. A laugh that came easier than it had in months. A spark of interest when a visiting instructor talked about adaptive sports and technology. One afternoon, I found him in the living room, sketchbook balanced on his knees, completely absorbed. "I forgot how much I liked this," he said without looking up. "Forgot what?" I asked. "Making things," he replied. "Stuff that didn't exist before." I watched him then, really watched him. Not as the boy who had been hurt, but as the person he was becoming. He was still gentle, still observant. But there was something new in him now, a steadiness. A quiet confidence forged not from ease, but from survival. We didn't talk about the case anymore. Not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer needed to dominate every breath. It became part of our history, not our future. On the anniversary of the day everything changed, Benjamin asked if we could do something different. "I don't want to sit around being sad," he said. "I want to go somewhere." So we did. We drove out of town, windows down, music low. The road stretched ahead of us, open and ordinary and full of possibility. When we stopped at a lookout, he wheeled himself to the edge and stared out at the horizon. "It's weird," he said. "I didn't think I'd ever feel okay again." I stood beside him, hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Okay is a good place to start," I said.
He smiled then.
A real one. Not the careful kind. Not the brave one he wore for other people. Just a smile. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't the ending I would have chosen for him, but it was an ending that left room for beginnings. And as we turned back toward the car, the sun dipping low behind us, I knew with quiet certainty that Benjamin's story was far from over. It was just being written differently now. And so was mine. If you're still here, still listening, I want you to know something first. That matters. It matters more than you probably realize. When I first started telling the story, I didn't do it because I wanted attention. I did it because silence almost swallowed us whole. Silence is powerful like that. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It just waits. And most of the time, it wins because people get tired. Because pain is heavy. Because fighting systems feels impossible when you're already exhausted just trying to survive the day. I didn't know how this story would land when I began. I didn't know if anyone would care. I didn't know if speaking would help or make things harder. What I did know is this. Pretending everything was fine nearly broke my son in a way no injury ever could. Benjamin didn't just lose movement that day. He lost a sense of safety. He lost the belief that adults always step in when things go too far. He lost the idea that being kind automatically protects you. Watching that happen to your child changes you in ways that are hard to explain. It rearranges your priorities. It strips away illusions you didn't even know you were living under. There were nights I sat alone and wondered if I'd done the right thing. Nights when the house felt too quiet, when the future felt too uncertain, when the weight of every decision pressed down on my chest until breathing felt like work. I questioned myself more times than I can count. I replayed conversations. I imagined alternate versions of reality where I stayed quiet, where I smiled politely, where I focused only on recovery and nothing else. But here's the truth I've learned the hard way. Healing and silence are not the same thing. Peace built on denial is fragile. It cracks the moment reality pushes back. Benjamin is still healing. Some days are easier than others. Some days are frustrating, painful, slow. But he is here. He is growing. He is learning who he is now, not who the world tried to reduce him to in a single afternoon. And watching him do that has taught me more about strength than any victory ever could. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't always look like confidence or certainty. Sometimes it looks like showing up when you're tired. Sometimes it looks like asking hard questions even when your voice shakes. Sometimes it looks like refusing to accept a version of events that asks you to betray your own child for the comfort of others. If you're watching this and you're a parent, I want you to hear this clearly. Your instincts matter. If something feels wrong, it probably is. You don't need permission to ask questions. You don't need approval to protect your child. You don't need to make yourself smaller so that other people can stay comfortable. If you're watching this and you've been hurt by classmates, by institutions, by people who should have protected you, I want you to know that what happened to you matters, even if it was minimized, even if it was dismissed, even if no one ever apologized. Your pain doesn't need validation from the people who caused it to be real. And if you're watching this and you're one of the many people who felt uncomfortable listening to it, that matters too. Discomfort is often where growth starts. Stories like this are meant to be easy. They're meant to make us look at the systems we trust and ask whether they're worthy of that trust. I don't tell this story because I enjoy reliving it. I tell it because somewhere out there is another Dorothy sitting in a hospital hallway, staring at a closed door, being told everything will be fine while knowing deep down that it won't be simple. I tell it because somewhere there is another Benjamin learning that surviving something doesn't automatically mean being believed. And if this story reaches even one of them before silence does, then it's worth telling. Justice didn't arrive the way movies promise it will. There were no grand speeches. No instant resolutions. Just slow accountability and hard truths that couldn't be erased once they were spoken out loud. That kind of justice doesn't feel triumphant. It feels necessary. Our lives didn't return to what they were before. They couldn't, but they didn't end either. They changed. And change, I've learned, doesn't have to mean loss alone. Sometimes it means clarity. Sometimes it means choosing a future that's honest instead of convenient. Benjamin once asked me if what happened to him would define the rest of his life. I told him the same thing I'll tell you now. What defines you isn't the worst thing that happens to you. It's what you build afterward, even when the foundation cracks. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying. Thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing witness. Stories like this don't survive without people willing to hear them, and silence only loses its power when enough people refuse to participate in it. If you want to support stories like this, if you want to help keep conversations like this alive, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what resonated. Tell me your story if you're ready. Every single interaction helps push these stories a little further into the light, where they can't be ignored. Because together, we're doing more than telling stories. We're reminding each other that truth still matters, that accountability still matters, that even when systems fail, people don't have to, and that sometimes simply refusing to stay quiet is how everything begins.